Welcome to Talk Gnosis, the show about Gnosticism, mysticism, the esoteric, shape-shifting lizard people, underground cloning caves, conspiracy, alternative religion, meditation, yoga, and anything else we feel like talking about. I'm Deacon John, live from Montreal, and joining me is the other half of the Aeonic syzygy that is Bishop Lainey Peterson in Chicago. Bishop, how are you?
I am awesome. How are you, Deacon?
I am particularly good today because we have a topic that's near and
We
dear
do.
to both of our hearts.
Yes.
And we're hoping the vast majority of our audience, which is conspirituality. And we've got a really awesome guest to talk about it. It's Matthew Remski. Matthew, say hi. And if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. I know that you're an author, you're a podcaster, but take it away, Matthew.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation. Yeah, Matthew here from Toronto. I've been a yoga culture critic for probably the last 12 years or so. I'm a two-time cult survivor, and so I've done a lot of research and journalism in cultic dynamics and institutional abuse in contemporary yoga and Buddhism communities, particularly. I just released a book, well, not just, I suppose a year and a half ago now, that detailed institutional abuse within Patabi Joyce's Ashtanga yoga community over decades. And I'm a little bit proud of that book because it is the first kind of analysis of systemic abuse in the yoga world, and it gives some some answers to how it happens. So I appreciate that I had the time and the guidance to get that done. Currently, I'm one of the co-hosts of the Conspirituality podcast, where we delve into the topic that we'll be introducing today. So thanks for the invitation.
Oh, we're so happy to hear you,
Yeah.
and to have you. We're so happy. This is something that we're happy people.
Tiny
Well,
happy people.
yes, I don't know about that part either. I wish I was tinier and I wish I was happier. But before we get into this topic, so near and dear to our hearts, something that Bishop and Lainey and I love talking about off hours, I have to do a bit of homework, which is begging for your money. I have to do it now because you're going to love this show so much that when we sign off, you're not going to hear the commercial then, because you're going to be going and buying Matthew's books and subscribing to his podcast and reading his blog. So if you can, please help us out by going to patreon.com/Gnostic. For as little as $1 per piece of media per month. You can also put a cap on that in case we, release 100 pieces of media. You can support the show, support the blog, support everything that we're doing. I know that these are hard times and that you can't necessarily donate financially. However, we do need money to keep the show going. We do hire the world's best digital studio, 99 Perspectives, out of Chicago. But if you can't help us financially, please like and subscribe, leave us a review, share the show, even take it and email it to somebody you think would like it, or send it to a conspiracy theorist in your life, particularly this episode. The other thing you can do as well, you don't want to sign up for Patreon and pay us every month. You can go to paypal.me/Gnostic and you can do a one-time donation there. So the commercial is out of the way. We can get into the fun stuff. Matthew, we're going to start with a really easy question. That's a joke. The question is, what is conspirituality?
Well, yeah, not an easy question. Thankfully, my colleagues and I had a lot of guidance in forming our thoughts around this particular phenomenon, most of which come from an academic paper published by Charlotte Ward and David Voas in 2011. And I've got the abstract here because it's very clear. I'm just going to read it if that's okay. Yeah. They write that the female-dominated New Age, with its positive focus on self, and the male-dominated realm of conspiracy theory, with its negative focus on global politics, may seem antithetical. There is a synthesis of the two, however, that we call conspirituality. We define, describe, and analyze this hybrid system of belief. It has been noticed before without receiving much scholarly attention. Conspirituality is a rapidly growing web movement expressing an ideology fueled by political disillusionment and the popularity of alternative worldviews. It has international celebrities, bestsellers, radio and TV stations. It offers a broad politico-spiritual philosophy based on two core convictions. The first traditional to conspiracy theory, the second rooted in the New Age. So one, a secret group covertly controls or is trying to control the political and social order. And two, humanity is undergoing a paradigm shift in consciousness. So proponents believe that the best strategy for dealing with the threat of a totalitarian new world order is to act in accordance with an awakened new paradigm worldview. They go on to say in the essay that in part what happens with conspirituality is it offers participants the ability to temper their political cynicism with spiritual hopefulness. So we found that to be a really sort of cogent guiding definition for the term. But then, of course, we explore how it plays out in the world as well. And some of the things that we focus on in particular is the way in which catastrophic or very stressful world events can be immediately mobilized by conspirituality producers to begin to offer salvation solutions really on the fly. We've noticed that people who are proponents of conspirituality are often using the techniques, the cultic techniques of fostering disorganized attachment amongst their followers. So a great example of this would be somebody like Mickey Willis, who's the director of or the producer of the fake documentary Plandemic, and the second one as well, where he releases the films and then he goes on to social media and he sort of professes in sermon-like context his love for everybody who's viewing and how we're all in this together, and if we can really bind together and form a single body, or we can enter into communion or something like that, we'll all be saved or we'll all be safe. And what's really happened is that as in a very vigorous cultic dynamic, he's scared the crap out of people on one day, and then he's loving them up the next. And this begins to, especially as it oscillates back and forth, warning, 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 love, 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 terrible thing is happening, terrible thing is happening, salvation is the answer. As we flip back and forth between those two modes of presentation, the person who is vulnerable begins to enter into, at least according to Alexandra Stein, the cult theorist, into a trauma bond with that influencer. And so we look at that. We look at conspirituality as what I would call a form of disaster spirituality, going on the work of Naomi Klein, who coined the term disaster capitalism. We also can see that people who are really good at conspirituality have already been sort of prepared in New Age wellness and yoga Buddhist, global economies for the moment, because they already have the outreach, they already have the platforms, they already have the kind of charismatic presentational style that works for conspirituality. So those are some of the elements that we cover.
Right. And sorry to follow a huge entire question that we could just, struggle with that definition for the rest of the episode.
Right.
But however, I've got something just as big, if not bigger.
Right.
Matthew, I know this one's tough to sum up, but what is QAnon?
Yeah, well, just full disclosure, you sent this particular question along before, and so I took the time to compile some notes, and it's really complex. It's a triggering discourse, and those two things, the complexity and the triggering nature of it, is actually part of the problem, and I would say part of the impact of QAnon. So I'll go through this really slowly, and if you have any questions, please stop me. Okay. So we, my colleagues Derek and Julian and I, we generally consider conspirituality to be an overarching type of discourse within which QAnon can take root. But it's also like a way in which people can be further radicalized to kind of like peak conspirituality. QAnon is like peak conspirituality. There's a cosmic battle going on that's going to be resolved in a great awakening, and something utopic is going to take its place once the satanic elites are defeated. But I would also want to say that if you can get to QAnon through conspirituality, you can also get to it through other pathways. And maybe we can think of QAnon as being this kind of like a kingdom or something like that people enter, or even a church perhaps that they enter, but they approach it from certain territories, and conspirituality is one of those territories. But we also know that people come to QAnon through the alt-right, through the intellectual dark web, through white nationalism movements, through evangelical Christianity, survivalist movements, ethno-nationalism. And then, we've seen in recent demonstrations in Germany, old school fascism groups with flying the German imperial flag because they can't fly the swastika by law. They're flying flags beside the Q flags. So all of these routes towards QAnon have their languages, their values. The values are sometimes conflicting, but once people cross the border into the land of QAnon, into the church of QAnon, because some people are starting to call it an emerging religion, they find a common cause through a very intense mythology, but also a gaming process that's highly structured. It's charged by the dopamine sort of mechanisms of social media, and it's also highly changeable and adaptable. With regard to the structured part, the basic storyline of QAnon is that there is a anonymous deep state mole named Q, and named Q because of a particularly high level of security clearance that they are said to have. Now, they might also be a network of moles. There might be 6 of them. People will say there's 10 or 12 or no more than 15. Nobody's clear on that. But from within their position in the so-called deep state, Q posts messages about how Hillary Clinton especially is about to be, well, this is the first major Q drop, is that Hillary Clinton and other Democratic officials are about to be indicted for crimes and for pedophilic activity and for all kinds of dastardly deeds, and somehow Donald Trump is secretly working to bring these arrests about and eventually destroy the network that the satanic elites belong to. And what these elites do, and all of the trigger warnings here for the audience, if you haven't heard this part of the story yet, is that they allegedly both traffic and breed children to abuse. And then this abuse is not just prurient, it's that the children are abused so that their bodies will become sort of batteries for a particular kind of substance called adrenochrome. Now, that's supposed to be medically extracted as some kind of drug that will promote the longevity of cabal members while also getting them high. But adrenochrome is an actual bodily substance, and it can't be rendered for any such purpose. But this is where there's always some sort of kernel of facticity in any of these things to make them plausible. But in this sense, QAnon and its narrative hints at the specter of like complete demonic social breakdown that precedes an apocalyptic moment of revelation in which all evil can be exposed and purified. So that's where, believe it or not, Donald Trump comes in, and right, because he's central to QAnon faith. The prophecy is that through an event called the Storm, which itself is the peak of the Great Awakening, Trump will direct federal agents to arrest and execute all cabal members, and all of the children will be freed, including those who are hidden in the abandoned subway tunnels of New York. So, anybody who has any history on board, a lot of this will sound familiar. Mm-hmm. And we have a rehash here of medieval conspiracies about Jews controlling everything. There's vampirism. These stories have been around for a long time. And I would say, too, that they pick up on a recently unresolved set of threads that come to us from the late 80s and early 90s in the form of the Satanic Panic. And we had a guest on, a friend of mine on the podcast, Dr. Theo Wildcroft, who made the really poignant point that our legalistic and journalistic systems of narration and evidence and analysis have pretty much said case closed on that entire era. But she pointed out, as a trauma survivor herself, that stories like that, dismissed as moral panics, will always contain silenced truths. Right. So part of what we try to explore on the podcast is the fact that the language of QAnon might be appealing to so many people because it offers a symbolic framework for speaking the unspeakable in their own histories, in their own memories. And so as we know, it's like many elements of the Satanic Panic were mythic or counterfactual. We know that there was very, very little, if any, forensic evidence turned up in thousands of investigations. But on the other hand, the Epstein network is not a fiction. Yeah. And so we have to be really careful with the emotions at play in this stuff, because we do live in a world of institutional abuses. Mm-hmm. And so somehow we have to deal with that. So yeah, I've got other things to say, but that's a basic overview. It's had incredible cultural and political impact. Some listeners may not know that there's as many as 80 congressional candidates in the United States who are now running, who have professed some kind of allegiance to or commitment to QAnon as an ideology.
Yes, and it's rather American focused, with the emphasis on Trump as the one fighting the cabal, but it is spreading around the world. There is Q activity here in Canada, and even in lots of even more obscure places, right? Right.
Yeah, according to Concordia religious studies scholar Marc-André Argentino, QAnon is now in 76 distinct countries, according to social media analysis. Content is being translated. A lot of content is actually being translated from Radio Quebec, and I forget who the guy is, but he's the main Q propagandist in Quebec, but his materials are going to Belgium, to France, but also to North Africa and other French-speaking places. But they're also being translated into Spanish and Italian. And what's interesting is that QAnon, as it diversifies and as it becomes transnational and transcultural, it picks up local politics, especially of the alt-right variety, on the way. So, as it makes its way into Canada, for example, I just was speaking to a source who told me that they saw a Q sign at the Melee in Red Deer, Alberta, just 2 nights ago, where there was an anti-racism protest that was disrupted by racist counter-protesters, and there were physical altercations that broke out. But the identification of the counter-protesters was firmly white supremacist, with several members wearing jackets belonging to the Sons of Odin, I think the group is. But then there was also Q paraphernalia as well. And so QAnon is as a framework, as a big tent conspiracy theory, not only accommodates every other possible conspiracy theory, from what Bill Gates is doing with vaccines, to what 5G is really about, to what kind of transmission device Joe Biden has in his head. Like all of those things get grouped into and can be absorbed into QAnon as though it were some amazing imperialistic co-optation device, and at the same time, as it crosses borders, it will pick up local grievances along the way, especially if they haven't been, if the proponents of these local movements haven't felt that they've had unifying strength. And so you have these very strange allegiances. I was speaking to a source in Maine who is saying that there's a movement, the anti-vax movement in Maine, which is fueled, or it's provoked or pushed along by some QAnon propaganda as well, is actually finding common cause with anti-abortion activists, but using the moniker of "my body, my choice," and that comes into anti-masking debates as well. So what we have is these relationships between extremist groups or protest groups, relationships of convenience that the narrative of QAnon allows to be that much more lubricated or harmonic.
Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt here just a second, because there's a lot you're saying that's resonating with my own observations. One of the things that I've noticed, and this has been going on for a long time, is there is also a convergence between so-called crunchy hippies or leftists, whatever you want to call them, or New Agers, and conservative religious people, through the use of multi-level marketing companies that sell questionable supplements and treatments. And of course, many of those organizations have been accused of using manipulative, if not cult-like tactics as it is. But there's always that connection has been going on for decades. So there's another convergence there, which of course can be exploited by anti-vax rhetoric, along with everything else. So that's something that I just started to think about when you were talking.
Right. Well, I think it's going to take a lot of analysis, but it'll be very fruitful to figure out how MLM networking and recruitment tactics have been taken up by the political objectives of QAnon ideology, or mobilized by this ideology, because we know that. Especially from a lot of recent great reporting on the QAmom phenomenon, or Pastel Q, or there was a great Atlantic article called the Instagram influencers who are making QAnon look beautiful. We know that people in wellness, multi-level marketing, essential oils, whatever, have been able to deploy their existing marketing networks to spread this particular kind of brainworm. So it's an extraordinary sort of confluence of influences and technologies and networks that are already tickering along. And I really, what is clearest in the research that we do on this is that nobody has a clear picture. There's so many moving parts, and it moves so fast. It changes so fast. So often what we do on the podcast is we really try to bring it back down to, basic considerations of human care and empathy, and what we can do day by day to feel as though there is sanity that's possible in the world.
The other thing that occurred to me when you were talking about the kind of disorganized attachment that's going on with the love bombing and going back and forth, and you have a trauma bond, is of course that is exactly what abusers do. Whether you're talking about domestic partnerships or parent and child or various other types of abuse. And so if you have somebody who has been raised in such a household, somebody who perhaps has in fact been the victim of ongoing sexual abuse and is looking for a mythic framework in which to make sense of this, they would be, it seems to me, very responsive to the kind of QAnon, which brings all that in. It brings in alternative health, but it also brings in molestation and exploitation and trafficking, and it brings that all together, and along with a presentation style that would really resonate with somebody who was raised in that kind of a traumatic, abusive context and has perhaps not ever really had the kind of supportive therapy that they need to reintegrate their personality and live a healthy life. So that also occurred to me as well.
Well, I think definitely those who are vulnerable to QAnon, who have histories that mesh with its narrative, are, they are being exploited in heinous ways. I do want to say, though, that at least from my understanding of going through the narratives on QAnon casualties, the subreddit group, I think it has 25,000 members there now, and it's just incredible posts from family members and partners and people describing how they've lost relationships to this brain worm. It's kind of like in the cult literature. We don't really have any solid predictors for who gets indoctrinated or who gets recruited, right? Like, people will describe their family members as, struggling with substance abuse or, being abuse victims themselves, or, being historically vulnerable or having had psychiatric diagnoses or what have you. And then there will be lots of descriptions of people who, they were living perfectly fine lives. They were productive. They were happy. their relationship was clear. And so I think it's very poignant to consider how people who are already dealing with the burden of trauma might be further exploited by a kind of ideology that makes them into heroes as well, right?
Sure.
People who can solve the problem. And this is another thing that Dr. Wildcroft pointed out in that episode, which is that, there's QAnon offers a sense of agency, and anything that's going to push back against it is probably going to have to, offer the same in return. So yes, while this is particularly tragic to think of that level of exploitation, it's we run the risk sometimes of further stigmatizing the trauma victim as being vulnerable to kookiness, when in fact it might be the trauma victim who has developed really clear critical thinking skills, and is able to see how the manipulation is unfolding. So it's really interesting. It's the same issue is coming up in speculations around are given the demographics of recruitment, especially through the Midwest of the United States, does it intersect with the opiate epidemic? Right? Like, are people getting red pilled when they're actually on benzos? Because they're at home, they're in pain, and YouTube is there, and the algorithm is going to feed them more and more interesting or extreme things. So yeah, it's I think it's really it's very everybody is going to have a very deep human interest in, well, who falls for this, right? But I always just like to hold myself clearly in I'm in speculative mode now. I really don't know.
Yeah. Lainey actually brought up an interesting connection when she talked about the multi-level marketing as a nexus between the crunchy granola and more right-wing and conservative elements and bringing them together.
Right.
And now I've actually been following Q for a long time. I've always been someone who's been interested in conspiracy theories, studying them, not believing them. Which for me, white middle class kind of quirky guy, that was sort of a thing that we did in the '90s and early 2000s. You would read books about conspiracy theories, and sometimes you'd get together with your buds because you're super cool guys and you didn't talk to girls, and you'd be like, "Hey, did you hear this one? This one's even nuttier." So
Right.
I've been following Q for a while, and it really seemed to have a strong conservative evangelical Christian bent. There's lots of the cabal that Trump is fighting against is satanic in a literal way.
Yeah.
Trump is God's chosen guardian, chosen warrior, and a lot of the people who seem to be posting about Q, engaging with Q, seem to have strong Christian backgrounds that they're bringing into the conspiracy theory.
Right.
Now, you've already touched on this a little bit and talking about this connection that Lainey brought up. Isn't there a growing amount of sort of yoga, new age, wellness practitioners, meditators, what we call sort of alternative religion people now embracing Q?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, we've had some big media coverage of what we call our red pilled page on the podcast website, where we list over 24, and it's a very incomplete list because we're getting contacts and leads every day. But the list consists of people who, at one point or another, have posted, pro QAnon content or Q related content, and are also within yoga, wellness, Buddhism, meditation, alternative health, and healing. So yeah, there's an enormous overlap, and it's one of these confounding, political horseshoes where just as the MLM might bring together the conservatism of Mormons in Utah with the back to nature rhapsodies and romanticisms of plant medicine people. We have just as many, it seems, yoga and wellness people moving towards this material, and sometimes softening its evangelical language or substituting out the clear rapture references like Great Awakening or Storm or what have you with other frameworks for spiritual transformation, like the movement from 3D consciousness to 5D consciousness and so on. But yeah, I mean, what we have is people signing on to Conspirituality and then moving towards QAnon through a confluence of, anti-authoritarianism, alt health libertarianism, antipathy towards medical systems, and especially in the United States, medical predation, and the completely broken healthcare system. So it makes sense in the States that, we have this really extreme ability for QAnon to successfully push Dr. Fauci as some kind of, evil wizard, because, what is it? 40 million Americans don't have healthcare insurance. And so why would they believe that anybody with a lab coat is trying to take care of them? It's like, that's not what the country is about. That's not what it's done. And I think, just as a side note, and maybe you have some thoughts on this, John, I think maybe that universal healthcare in Canada is actually going to provide a very strong cultural buffer against the alt health libertarianism and paranoia of QAnon, because we're not doing great with COVID, especially in Ontario, but at least people know that they can go to the hospital and not go bankrupt. So yeah, I mean, other ideas that yoga people bring to the QAnon table would be things like, if one is sufficiently spiritually advanced, that they will be immune, and then that sort of plays out in narratives around how how the righteous will survive COVID. And then also there's these purification motifs that allow for the complete externalization of demons. And we see that in yoga and New Age wellness as well. And really, the three core tenets, according to the social psychology of cults, that nothing is as it seems, everything is connected, and nothing happens by accident. These are like these are like tenets of New Age and modern yoga and modern global Buddhist religiosity. And so it's like the groundwork for conspiracism is already laid. It's a fit.
Yeah. Is there a history already of yoga, the New Age, wellness practitioners, alternative religion folks already embracing conspiracies, or is this something that's new with sort of Q and COVID?
I mean, there's a history of deep connections between, I can speak most, sort of in a qualified way about, let's say, early modern yoga. There are strong connections between, yoga as an emerging global movement, cultural movement in the early 20th century, coming out of India, and its relationship to fascism, especially as it is being conceived as both a wellness program, but also a way of rebuilding and glorifying and restoring confidence to the Indian body politic as the age of colonialism passes. And so, a lot of people are kind of shocked to, believe, or to find out that very, very popular cross-cultural pollination between the emerging Hindu nationalist, modernizers and fascist ideas coming out of Europe, even and including Nazi Germany. To this day, in fact, Hitler's Mein Kampf is a best-selling book in the English language amongst Hindu nationalists in India. And so, it's like Nazism itself is built upon the conspiracy of the invading other, and the blood and soil of the native German being inaccessible to them because of invaders and so on. So now how this plays into alternative health practices through time is that increasingly the body becomes the site of national pride and national purity in many of these wellness practices, including things like early bodybuilding, where people like Eugene Sandow, the Olympic bodybuilder, would go on tour throughout the world and say to his primarily white audiences, we have to, especially men, we white men have to make our bodies strong in order to avoid racial suicide, was the term that he used, because he realized that, industrialization and urbanization was making, the bourgeoisie very physically weak. And so they had to get up and exercise, because the people who were actually getting stronger were the people who were doing manual labor, and they generally had brown skin. And so we have this, this sort of rat's nest of, the blossoming of the 20th century nation state, the throwing off of colonialism in India, the development of physical culture throughout Europe, and its integration into the public school system, all of these being symbols of national pride, and they all have to do with the sanctity of one's connection to the land. And so that's sort of the alternative health theme, right? Is, how can we survive here, and how can we keep this place clean, and how can we make sure that this soil where we are rooted to is always preserved, meaning it's always ours.
Yeah. You mentioned Epstein earlier, which kind of proves that elites, actually some elites, really do traffic children. Conspiracy theories really do happen. Some very serious one, something that I think of as quote unquote WMDs in Iraq. This was a lie that led to the deaths of millions. So
Right.
how do we counter conspiracy theories in a world that's full of conspiracies?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we have to distinguish between the conspiracy as a fact and the conspiracy theory as a story about an alleged set of facts. And it's as I go on with this, I'm not really happy with the language that we're using because the term conspiracy theory really does obscure what comes to be understood as true once survivors are listened to, or once investigation really goes its course, or once there's adequate policing paid to a particular problem. I tend to think of QAnon more and more as, instead of a conspiracy theory, a brainworm or a fever dream. It's a phenomenon of social contagion that is highly emotive, that is resistant to rational discussion. If you try to explain to a real QAnon devotee why they're mistaken, they will likely double down. There will be a backfiring effect. And so I try to emphasize not that it's something that can be disproven, but that it's something that feels incredibly intense and is incredibly attractive, but also harmful at the same time. And so, yeah, I mean, to answer your question very simply, absolutely. Epstein committed conspiracy to abuse minors for decades. Harvey Weinstein committed conspiracy, and those around him committed conspiracy to sexually assault people in the movie industry. Larry Nassar committed, there was a conspiracy for him to remain untouched by law enforcement by his employers. These are clear. And so, I think that the proponent of QAnon who says, conspiracy theory is a term made up by the CIA to, discredit marginalized groups. I mean, it wasn't made up by the CIA. It has a long history before that, so that's actually wrong. But they have a point, which is that the way in which people will discredit the survivors of Epstein and Weinstein and Larry Nassar is that they will stigmatize their stories as being fanciful or implausible or what have you. But it feels to me like there's a qualitative difference between the number of young gymnasts who come forward to their various governing bodies and say, "This is what Larry Nassar did to me," and what we see in the transmission of QAnon ideas from person to person on the internet. Like, those are just qualitatively different. Mm-hmm. And one is that the survivor of Larry Nassar has to work up an incredible amount of courage and wherewithal and overcome all kinds of shame and fear of recrimination in order to break her silence. And and what they're greeted with, is a is a brick wall, and the conspiracy is the brick wall. It feels like just dead space, that somebody's crying into the void. Well, if we call QAnon a conspiracy or a conspiracy theory, we've got to sort of like deal with that qualitative difference, that as a set of ideas, it obviously feels incredibly attractive, hypnotic, just totally immersive, and there's this technological aspect to it as well. So yeah, you've got a great question there, John, and I think I think it would be good if we started being more careful about the term conspiracy theory, because it's unnecessarily stigmatizing and polarizing. I mean, maybe fever dream isn't better, but at least it moves the conversation away from, oh, here's a coherent set of ideas that we should be able to argue against. It's not really about that. It's more like, here's an emotional contagion, and it's being maintained by all kinds of online feedback loops, and that's how it's escalating. And when people talk about, falling into a rabbit hole or getting red pilled, they're usually describing like a deeply somatic and entranced experience. And yeah, so that whole feeling element of what it means to be wrapped up in QAnon is really not served by the term conspiracy theory.
Yeah. Lainey, we're starting to get into that home stretch. I'm sad. I feel like we will need a part 2 for this, because it is a topic dear to our hearts. But before I get into some wrap-up questions, do you have anything you want to talk about, add, ask Matthew? Hop in there.
I would love to hear, but I think we're gonna have to do a part 2, because if Matthew's agreeable to it, because I would like to talk about strategies that people, particularly in turbulent times, can put into place to protect themselves. And the only thing I was thinking of is, for example, as Jonathan knows, I'm very into dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I did a couple years back to kind of study myself in what was becoming an increasingly difficult and challenging social and political landscape here in the U.S. is I joined a federal organization that's devoted to training civilians to respond to emergencies and disasters.
Wow, and great.
One of the things that happened there is, first of all, I got to work with professionals. I was actually getting, I was learning what the actual best practices are in the US and around the world for dealing with these issues. I learned about disaster psychology. And yes, I was able to go back and to see some Cold War films from the 50s and 60s and realize they knew what disaster psychology was back then. We know what it is now. And I actually started working with law enforcement officers, with paramedics, fire department people, emergency management officers. And I became, first of all, I was able to actually get real information from real people, concrete information. Second thing is I was able to work with other people who had similar concerns, and I was able to actually physically be of service. And that helped to ground me in many ways and to keep my mind from going off in 15 different directions all the time.
Fantastic. That's great.
So I'm wondering, though, if that, that might be a strategy for some people, is actually getting involved at the community level. But there's other things as well. And if you have any ideas that we could come up with quickly, I'd love to hear them. Otherwise, we can always do a part 2.
Well, I'm happy to do a part 2, but I think the main thing that stands out in what I've heard you describe is that it's really great to have outside expertise that is interdisciplinary, and I think that's really crucial, because I find myself as a cult survivor and researcher, I have a lot of tools that describe the process of indoctrination, the process of trauma bonding within the disorganized attachment field of the charismatic leader. I understand systems of behavioral, emotional thought, information control. I understand how that stuff works. At the same time, most of the cult literature is pre-digital. And so it's not really taking into account the spreading mechanism of the online environment and what that actually means. And so, I think most people who are trained to, or at least have the temperament to look at QAnon as being as being a mythology or having religious elements to it, they're going to be approaching it from a very humanities heavy background. But what I want to hear from is, the digital humanities people who understand what it means to actually stop the spread of a brain worm if it is taking over vulnerable communities. And that's not something that the cult experts that I talk to really are clear on, because they're really operating out of a different age.
Right.
And so, one example that has really exemplifies the learning curve that I've been on while we've developed this podcast is to speak with Imran Ahmed, who he runs the Center for Countering Digital Hate in the UK, and he basically said, the thing that you have to do with disinformation, whether it's conspirituality or QAnon or anti-vax or pseudoscience, is you have to treat it like a virus, because its proliferation points happen online through engagement. And so it made me realize in a very chilling moment that everything that I humanly want to do to connect with a person who is being preoccupied by this material, who has been indoctrinated, or who has, fallen under its spell, that what I want to do to, hold out my hand to them, to bolster relationship with them, if that happens online, I actually increase their engagement, and I increase the exposure of their content and their ideas to the algorithm, and the algorithm will pick it up and run with it, because that's how it makes money. And so, the digital stuff and how that works is part of my steep learning curve, and it means that, just like you looking into disaster psychology and what people do on the ground, I realized that I have to learn, how does influence actually stampede across online networks, and where does it completely not make sense to do the thing that I feel like I'm trained to do, which is to talk to somebody about it, right? And yeah, so yeah, lots of stuff to learn there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I've got one last question to wrap it up. And Matthew, we don't expect you to be an expert in Gnosticism. It's a little obscure, but it's one of its more or less central tenets is things are not what they seem to be, and the religion does attract conspiracy theorists, and it's a very realistic, common experience for people like me and people like Bishop Laney, who have local communities, are doing meetings, services, book clubs, that someone will come in and they'll start talking about the shape-shifting lizard people, or they'll talk about how Obama is a clone of an ancient pharaoh. These are two real-world examples. Right. So do you have any advice specifically for Gnostic communities about how to grapple with this?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that I am not an expert in Gnosticism. I don't know much about it at all. I mean, maybe my whatever answer I have depends on me asking you a question, which is, if it's a central tenet that things are not what they seem to be, what does that provide for the community? What does that allow your spirituality to do?
Right. Yeah, that's an awesome question, which would need another show for us to go into.
Okay, so maybe that's not fair if we're trying to wrap it up.
No, actually, it's really very helpful.
That is very helpful. Yeah.
Maybe I'll do a blog post as to why that's helpful. But
that's right, because because if there is, I think if it's a central tenet, and I can see the value in it, obviously, the question is, how, at what point is it either misunderstood, or is it mobilized, or is it weaponized against the user, against their interests, against their actual growth in maturity, or self-regulation, or whatever the goal is? Because, it's like you can't have an axiom out there that can then be abused, right, or weaponized against a member. So it seems to me like the answer to that question would really be about, okay, well, what does this principle really allow you to do, and where can it go off the rails?
Excellent.
Yeah, that's awesome. And as sounds like we're doing a second show, so maybe we'll pick that up and look
Sure.
forward, everybody, to look towards Bishop Laney's blog post on the topic. So, Matthew, that was awesome. We could have gone all night, and we're so happy that you joined us. And I really think that this is.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and this is definitely a show where, we do believe that we do something important, even in our small way. But I think this is a particularly relevant show that a lot of people out there are going to get a lot out of. So that means I'll end with a commercial. Please share it, everybody. Send it. Chances are there's someone in your life, even if they're in the periphery, who's been sucked into some kind of conspiracy theory. Who knows? Yes, that's right, or an MLM. So we all know somebody, if it's not yourself. So share this show. Hopefully it'll help them. And that's all I've got to say. So remember, visit patreon.com/Gnostic, paypal.me/Gnostic. We love you. I'm your best friend. We're your best friends. That's some sort of attachment right there. But I will never hurt you. I'll never say anything mean about you.
John and I are trauma bonded. Trust me on that one.
Yes. Okay. I'm signing off. Good night, everybody.